In 2018, Penguin released a collection of 50 classic books by 50 classic authors. We're going to be going over them in the next few weeks and delving into the issues behind what the writers were writing about. Follow us. George Orwell. First, we tackle his amazing Notes on Nationalism, now seen as a seminal piece on nationalism throughout the world. Welcome, Amir.
Thank you very much, Amir.
So the first thing I found interesting about Notes on Nationalism is that he's distinguished between patriotism and nationalism. Yeah. So he says that nationalism is kind of this ideology that becomes violent, and patriotism is, he describes as a devotion to a certain way of life. And there's different types. There's positive nationalism, there's negative nationalism, there's all kinds. So what I find interesting is what we said about the violence, because here, I mean, we can see that you kind of need this positive, aggressive nationalism when you're in war. And this is George Orwell writing in 1945, right? So it's just at the end of World War II. So, I mean, we can see Churchill, who comes out with these kind of big speeches about fighting in France, fighting on the beaches, we shall fight in the land, we shall fight in the air, we shall fight in the sea. And Churchill was actually awarded with a Nobel Prize for these kind of things. So we see that the aggressive nationalism is useful in those situations.
In defending some kind of thing that the individual holds dear. That would be quite similar to what a patriot.
Exactly. Yeah. But when we have, in 2019, people like the EDL come out and use the same language of Churchill to talk about 2019, I think we see a difference here. Do you feel there's a difference?
Sure. Well, with kind of modern day nationalism, I think it's still important to keep in mind that there is this defensive element, that the individual feels like there is something that they hold a value that is being threatened, and so if the resources aren't there, the only reaction, so to speak, is to kind of lash out in that manner. But one of the interesting notes towards the end is when he relates that to football, particularly this idea that football, especially on an international scale, is like mimic war, essentially, you know. And I see it happen to me, for example, when I'm not into football by any stretch of the imagination, but when I'm with my friends and they support a team, suddenly I feel this kind of communal, tribal kind of thing, you know, when I'm like, you know what, screw the other team, you know, and this is like something that I'm like, oh, like even I'm shocked about it, you know. And so this kind of collectivized energy, this mob feeling that occurs, where people may have different, like, you know, say for example, you support Manchester United. If you ask every Manchester United fan, what do you feel about Manchester United, you'll probably get a completely different answer out of all of them. Same with countries. You know, what's your feeling towards, you know, being French, for example, you know. It's not, you can't ground it. You know what I'm saying?
And that's what he said about inconsistency. He said that was one of the three elements, that you have different elements to nationalism, and you can kind of see and study it that way. So Orwell's listed the three characteristics as he sees them of different types of nationalism. Obsession, which is really about superiority. Instability, which is about a transferred nationalism. And an indifference to reality, a kind of tendency to mold facts into your feeling about your nation. So I think what you were describing there falls into the second category, which is instability, that people kind of transpose their own nationalism onto different things. So for example, it's been said a lot that in America, this idea of God comes down through the idea of being an American through the Constitution. Like the Constitution is almost
the channel.
It's almost equal to the Bible in how holy it is. Being American isn't just a nationality. It's a personality, it's an identity, right? Which is the really interesting thing about it. So you have this kind of line of, you know, the Declaration of Independence and kind of these ideas that have freed America as a nation, and then alongside that you have the religious ideas, and each one underpins the other one.
Definitely. And one of the interesting things about instability is that it can also transfer. So in the same way that you could one day have incredibly, and Orwell talks about this as well, where you can have very strong feelings towards one nation, towards one ideology.
Right.
And then it doesn't take that much to kind of bring you to a completely opposite or contradictory side, which is, in essence, it means that there's one kind of core sentiment of nationalism that kind of manifests in different ways, which means that all of those antagonistic forces actually have that in common.
Okay.
You know?
Okay. I mean, in there's a really kind of efficient takedown of G.K. Chesterton, who is a Catholic apologist. You know, he's making these great arguments for Catholicism in these times. And what he said is that, look, these things are real. Nationalism is real. But there are people who are kind of hypocritical about the way that they look at certain nations. So, for example, he said, look, he doesn't mind Mussolini and his kind of...
He's Italian.
Right, he's Italian. So Mussolini's kind of crushing freedom of the press, and he's, you know, dissolving democratic institutions. But because he's Italian, people like G.K. Chesterton don't mind too much. But when it comes to England and British authorities doing the same things here, or in India, suddenly these kind of people have issues to it, right? Absolutely. So there's a kind of mental
double
gymnastics. That's it. There's a double think going on.
What I enjoy most about Orwell's writing is this. There is a self-reflective element to it. You know.
Okay.
He isn't kind of like, I am speaking from a perspective where I'm free of all of these things that I'm talking about. And particularly towards the end of the first chapter, he does acknowledge that there is this sentiment within all thinkers. You may not even be able to get rid of it.
Okay,
but
that's true.
Acknowledging it,
That's
or
true.
being consciously kind of aware of it, it produces a type of a more rigorous kind of thought process, rather than giving into, some kind of
I mean, I thought Orwell. I mean, I'm not so sure about that. I think that when Orwell's writing, I think he's definitely writing from the perspective that he's writing on high, that he's looking down at others and thinking he personally doesn't have these same biases. I think it's true that he was fair about how he spoke about different groups. For example, there's anti-Semitism, there's neo-Toryism, and I thought that was really interesting, actually, the neo-Toryism thing, and he distinguishes it from standard conservatism by saying these guys, these neo-Tories, will not accept that Britain's power has declined because of the war, and every different group has their own bias, right? So you have the Irish nationalists who won't accept that England has helped,
or Trotsky is saying that people actually may like Stalin
as well. So everyone's got their bias. So I think he was fair in that regard. But I did get a bit of this self. I just thought he was kind of saying, look, this is what's going on, and I've enlightened beyond this point that I don't have this bias. Like, you guys, different groups are fighting, but I don't have these problems.
Right. So there's a part in page 31 where it says, you know, if you hate and fear Russia, if you're jealous of the wealth and power of America, if you no, you cannot get rid of those feelings simply by taking thought. So thought is not the mechanism to or the lens to see these things through, but you can at least recognize that you have them and prevent them from contaminating your mental processes. You know, which the emotional urges which are inseparable or inescapable, so to speak. So he does acknowledge that, you know, people, you can't run away from it. You know, even in the individuals that you may see yourself as being superior to in terms of thought, there is no superiority. It's just that you're recognizing something in them, and it's important to recognize that within yourself. And I think when it comes down to nationalism, that's incredibly important, in the same way that someone who doesn't care about football can get engaged in it out of nowhere. Out of nowhere.
So I think that's one thing that makes Orwell so clever, the fact that he suggests solutions, and he still acknowledges that these perhaps are problems that we may not be able to solve, right? So there's that acknowledgement there, and he's got some solutions in there. So now let's look at the modern day. Let's bring this back home now, right? So we're talking about nationalism, right? We're talking about Brexit going on 2016 to 2019, and Orwell's talked about Anglophobia, this idea that, you know, we don't we don't really like the Anglophobic worldview. But as I'm saying, Churchill is saying, we shall go to the end, we shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and the oceans, we shall fight in growing confidence, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields, in the streets, we shall never surrender. And, you know, people like Katie Hopkins and Tommy Robinson are using this language in 2019 in the UK in the sphere of Brexit, right? How does that relate to you? Does invoking Churchill feel right in that context?
Right. Well, again, in the context of Churchill, for example, no one's going to go to war for no reason.
Okay.
There has to be that connection to I'm defending something, or there's a sentimentality that you're protecting values that you truly deeply feel. You can't even articulate it.
Yeah.
But someone who's incredibly charismatic, who can kind of weave your thoughts and sentiments together, can say, actually, this is what you care about, and you need to go out and fight for it. And so today, with kind of rapid globalization, gentrification, a lot of these issues that we're seeing, there's a kind of sleight of hand where those same sentiments about kind of defending your country, they can take the form of this kind of nationalism, essentially. And it's interesting to see that, you know, other people who are kind of Anglophobic from the outside.
As a propagator of evil.
Yeah, who see Britain as a propagator of evil. There's this kind of dialectic going on. Those same energies are being used, essentially. Those same energies of, you know, this is us and this is them.
Okay.
And we need to protect what's ours. And, you know, be afraid of the enemy.
Okay.
You know, and these things are going on that they're not telling you, which kind of links into kind of anti-Semitism quite well. About an insidious force that you can't see, but it's happening, and you kind of see the manifestations here and there. And there's these, you know, these people who don't want you to have one. You know? And all of these kinds of kind of linguistic tools are being used to kind of re-insurge
and justify
and absolutely those kinds of feelings,
yeah,
you know, which is real. You know, these values that people have are real. So people's attachments to culture is very real. You know, people's attachments to community and all these kinds of things that they go and define them, and they define themselves.
Yeah, so that's how we define patriotism.
Yeah,
that's
real.
Rather than that's real, rather than a nationalism which becomes.
But when that's under threat, when you feel those things under threat, it doesn't take a lot for a spokesperson to say,
okay,
that's the problem.
Like Stalin, like Lenin, like Trump.
Right.
Okay,
that's
cool.
the issue. So there's an interesting part about when Orwell talks about football in particular, right? Which is, it's interesting because I don't know this objectively, but I don't know whether Orwell himself was good at football or played football. You know?
I think I heard he was in a team or something.
He was in a team.
Not for very long, but I think he did play in some form. Yeah.
In some form, yeah. I wonder how much that affected his kind of perspective on relating nationalism to football, because when you do, you know, in a kind of international level, you have these kinds of, especially we talk about like football hooliganism, for example, the kind of like whatever team or flying, you know, whatever the connection towards other people, suddenly they're your family, you know. And I'm wondering whether he was ever in that situation as either a player or how he kind of linked that into nationalism as a whole.
Okay, because once you're part of the national setup, you kind of feel the rivalry a bit more. Okay, well, thank you very much, Amir. Give us your rating. George Orwell, Notes on Nationalism, out of 10?
Out of 10? Oh, I love Orwell, so I'm going to give him a solid 9.
A 9?
Yeah,
all right, thank you very much.